I'm going to do two simple things in my speech. Firstly, I'm going to describe to you what it is that these charities look like and which actors are actually likely going to be giving these sums of money to them. And secondly, I'm going to explain to you why this supposed sum of money is much less important than the other ramifications that are likely going to occur if you take money from unsavory actors. Firstly then, what do we think the context of this situation actually looks like? I want to talk about four things here. Firstly, I want to point out that I want to characterize the donors that we're likely going to be receiving these offers from. It's likely going to be corporations or large foundations that are backed by immoral people. Things like dirty fossil fuel magnates, authoritarian leaders, or oligarchs. Companies invested in human rights abuses, etc. Second thing to note here is that even when it's about individuals, it's likely going to be about big ticket donors who everyone knows of. That is to say, since these are the only cases that you have the information to discriminate upon which donors are good and which donors are bad, most likely these are going to be the donors that we're receiving these donations from. Secondly, this organization is likely going to be large and well established. I'm speaking about the charity, right? For two important reasons. Firstly, note that successfully making the world a better place is expensive and often requires structures of scale. That's to say, there are large upfront costs, like hiring aid workers, establishing distribution networks, etc., that likely mean the charity that is in question is going to be one that is sufficiently well-funded, very popular, and very public. Second thing to note about this charity is that the types of charities that big donors tend to give to also tend to be well established for the clear reason of the publicity that they're likely going to gain from donating to said charities. Sure.
Is Jeff Bezos immoral?
I would say that that's probably up to the decision of the charity, and I don't think that specific examples are going to be the core or crux of how this debate is going to be won, but I personally think he's immoral. So, third thing to note on the context is note that not all charities are in fact doing good for the world, right? Many have problems with competition, there is a lack of transparency, and there have been high-profile instances of abuse, like, for example, the Red Cross. You know for certain that your charity is doing good, but you can't guarantee that other well-established charities will be, and this will be extremely important in terms of the way-off between what the significance of an additional sum of money looks like in comparison to the longevity and the health of your charity in this debate. The last thing that I want to note is that we will still allow for anonymous donations on either side of the house. And I think this is incredibly important because we do agree that even unsavory actors can have good faith donations. But we think people who truly need to donate in good faith are going to be willing to do so with no attachment to their name on either side of the house. So the first thing I want to then talk about is public image, and why is it that this ruins public image in two key ways. Firstly, with regards to the charity, and secondly, with regards to the unsavory actors. The first thing that I want to say is that it is established that our charity does do good with money, but what I think is more important to consider is how this can weigh off against the charity's other impacts. So the first thing I want to talk about then is why this leads to the whitewashing of unsavory characters' images, right? The first thing to note here is that charity is often done as a large publicity stunt that distracts people from often from recent controversies or overarching reputations. We importantly give a mechanism for unsavory characters an outlet to allow them to resist attention from the public and government that allows them to continue to conduct malicious acts. That is to say, examples like Russian oligarch Roman Abramovich, who was allowed to whitewash his image by giving back to local Chelsea grassroots organizations, even though the net harm of his company and his power and political influence in Russia probably did way worse when it comes to human rights atrocities and human rights abuses within his own country, right? Examples like this are why what the most important impact to consider in this debate is how we are enabling people to continue the malicious acts that they conduct outside of just their interest in our charity. The second thing to note here is that this is an independent harm of taking the money. Even if the money is going to do good, which we'll prove later on why it doesn't actually end up doing good, it has to be weighed against the direct harm created by enabling harmful actors to get PR benefits that you could otherwise prevent by directly identifying their malicious intent and naming and shaming them in public and then by returning the money. The second thing that I want to talk about is what the negative effects are on your charity itself. Before that, I'll take opening.
Roman Abramovich also gave money to the Conservative Party of the UK. Very unclear what is the main way they whitewash their image.
Yeah. But I agree that there are many ways that like these oligarchs and malicious figures can try to whitewash their image. I'm just saying that these tend to be some of the most high-profile ways in which they conduct it, and limiting it and turning it into an example or an instance where you can publicly shame them and bring up all of the negative and malicious things that they do is more important than giving them another way of whitewashing their image, right? Secondly then, why is this harmful for your charity. There's a number of aspects to this argument, right? The first thing to talk about is how taking bad donor money makes you liable to be attacked from watchdog groups and media scrutiny. That is to say, big donors will often donate for PR, but the same PR that helps their image is the same PR that likely hurts yours. Importantly, this means that it likely reduces the total amount of donation money that you will stand to get from other sources. Primarily small donors who tend to be quite clueless when it comes to deciding which charity that they're likely going to pick from, right? Oftentimes, the vast majority of the money that these charities operate off of come from individual grassroots donors who are likely picking between large public, large charities based off of the most recent controversy around them. The most likely scenario is that when you are the one who most recently took money from a malicious actor, that you're going to be the one that gets rejected by these smaller donors. The second thing to talk about here is, on top of this, you stand to lose support from your core base of workers, people who are very committed to the charitable cause and the volunteer time, and people who are willing to volunteer their time of day to work in this field. Note a few things, right? The first thing to note here is that these people's contributions is often far more important because charities face greater shortages of aid workers than they do of money. That is to say, getting financial contribution is relatively easy because the people who donate often get large advantages, e.g. the tax benefits and PR. However, on the contrary, getting people to work in the field is much harder because of the huge time commitment, opportunity cost, and of the potential dangers oftentimes associated with working in these charities. Note then, this means that even if you do get the money, this likely puts a huge constraint on you in terms of how far this money can go. The last thing that I want to then talk about is why taking a public and active stance against bad donors actively helps you differentiate from other large charities. The first thing to note here is that we know empirically that many large charities take money off of oil companies and other unsavory actors. On our side, this stance allows you to send a signal to individual donors that your group is unique because it is immune to the negative influences of unsavory actors, and it is willing to overall commit to the stance that they previously had when they did good for the world, as is established by this debate. This likely means that this causes many donors to channel money away from other charities and towards yours, ultimately affecting the world in a better way. I'm very proud to propose.
Thank you, Speaker, for that speech. Welcome the Leader of Opposition.
Starting in 3, 2, 1, go. Our case is very simple. You get a ton of money from immoral actors because they have by far the most incentive to donate. Therefore, you're able to do all of the good stuff that opposition wants to talk about, and most of their harms are extraordinarily minor. Why is it the case that we get substantial amounts of donations from immoral actors? Firstly, because the vast majority of rich people around the world are immoral. The argument we get from, or the response you get from Gov, is that it's relative to the charity. If you work for a charity, you've dedicated your whole life, in some cases turning down a cushy job in consulting for the sake of helping people because you believe you can do more. So presumably you are more moralistic or believing that people should be virtuous than the average person. So billionaires who make tons of money off relatively low paid workers are probably people you care about. And the vast majority of billionaires, even if they comply with labor standards in the West, are like companies like Nestle that in other countries do substantially oppress people all around the world. So I think you've turned down money from almost all of the wealthy people. They have by far the largest ability to donate because they have much more money and because they don't have to worry about things like groceries because they comprise a much smaller proportion of their revenue. Secondly, because these people want a good public image, and that's when your incentive is to give the highest. We get huge corporations giving 0.5% of their profits to ESG investing because they want to be able to tell people that they are trying to help the world alongside internal diversity initiatives, or you just want to, having made a ton of money as a Sackler family, be able to say, I'm part of the New York socialites, I want to be able to have a gallery of, like a wing of the Met in my name. These are the people that are trying to rehabilitate their image because they want to have a bunch of friends around them. They give tons of money. By contrast, one, even if we get like benevolent billionaires under their side of the house, A, these people are more likely to give to a vast minority of charities that you're probably not, which is things like effective altruism, which people like Bill Gates tend to give to. But two, these people are probably a minority compared to corporates that have far more money, because even billionaires usually own like 5% of the equity of the corporation they started. So even if you get these people, we want large corporations that are the immoral actors giving under our side of the house. So we get tons of money. They assert that grassroots charity, like grassroots is the vast majority of money this comes from, this is very unlikely because the average person doesn't just decide to give to a random charity. At best, they see an ad campaign for like UNICEF, but the vast minority of charities have a sufficient ad budget that they are able to convince people just on the subway to look at the charity's advert and then give, which means that primarily we are not talking about grassroots donations. Why do we need money? The first thing is, I think, as opening government points out, you need it to do things like scale operations, to pay volunteers, because the average person probably doesn't want to work for a random charity if it's not particularly large. So your ability to do good on a much larger scale, and by their own argument to be substantially more efficient, is a thing that requires you to have a ton of money. I just think that we get under our side, like if you're trying to distribute pills to the developing world, you get twice as many pills, because you have tons of money that you can use to buy these things, to set up in additional countries, or just distribute them all around the world. So all of the good that you do, we get. This is by far the most important short-term benefit under our side of the house. Their claim is they're already big established charities. One, even if that is true, we are saying that the reason they are big and established is because primarily immoral actors are giving, so just turning down this money means that you have to shut down substantially on a large number of institutions. But secondly, I think probably you are a relatively small charity under our side of the house, because the average charity just tends to be quite small because most of them don't have the large institutional budgets of things like the UN. They say that large charities are the only ones that do good. They can also be horribly efficient. For instance, the Red Cross is pretty bad. Lots of people have huge ad budgets, so it is not clear a priori that you're a small charity and that you don't need this money. Their second mech is to say that immoral people only give to these charities. Our claim is that on balance they're probably more likely to give to relatively smaller charities because that's when they can be the main donor and then advertise it. By contrast, if you give to the UN, you are outweighed massively by the huge countries giving money, so the incentive is to give to smaller companies. I now want to weigh versus some of the other arguments they say. They say, one, you lose donations because of bad image. A, these are smaller scale donations definitionally, so I'm not sure we particularly care. But secondly, the vast majority of donations are likely to be low key because it's not in your incentive as a charity to plaster on the front page, we took money from these oil tycoons. So the way this generally works is you have a list of key donors, the platinum tier is right on the bottom of the page, and that's where you list the oil companies because you don't want to advertise it, but that still lets the oil company themselves say to their investors that they pay this money. But the thing is that when people then donate to your charity, they don't necessarily associate with the oil company. But secondly, if this is true, that it outweighs all of the good you do, it must be that they are the vast majority of the money you get, which means that they have to bite our cost of becoming smaller in order for their arguments to function in this round. Secondly, in terms of arguments about political control, how the charity might be in some sense undermined in terms of its main goal, we would say that there is little incentive for charities to do this because the amount of money needed to substantially change what a charity does is astronomical. You need to be the vast majority of money given to this charity. So maybe at worst it is some slight moderation, which is not clear that is intrinsically bad, but it probably doesn't mean that you actually undermine what the charity tends to do in the vast majority of instances. But secondly, most corporations tend to diversify the amounts that they give to. For instance, an oil company might give a little bit to green tech, but it also will give a ton of money to just like helping women out or promoting them internally because they want to meet as many ESG criteria as possible, which means that they probably don't give sufficiently large amounts to any individual charity who are particularly worried about control. Secondly, what is it we think is the best way to put public pressure on immoral actors? And here's where I want to engage with opening government. The first thing to say is, if this incentive exists, they will just directly give to other charities, which means that the extent to which the world is harmed as a consequence of this is probably symmetric. But why is this worse? One, as an actor motion, you probably care a lot about your own charity, and this is likely to then mean that you have less money to do what you perceive to be good. So if you believe that you are doing good and you are less clear that the other causes that you could have worked on instead are as good, you feel worse off. But secondly, these charities are less likely to do good because the average charity finds it quite hard to do good because people give to a bunch of silly stuff that they think is cool in the moment that is not actually useful. So in general, the world is likely to do worse under their side of the house. Secondly,
Why is wealth accumulation inherently immoral?
I didn't say wealth accumulation was inherently immoral. I said that the means of acquiring it in most instances tends to be immoral. If you work in a charity, you probably don't believe that paying people a very small amount, which is what the public pressure billionaires to do is, because they run companies with investors that want them to do this, then you probably think that they are immoral, and OG said that was the criteria in this debate. I would say, on the best way of trying to convince billionaires to do good in the world, probably, and they don't believe this, them giving to charity does not outweigh the bad things that they do, running these corporations, producing fossil fuels, etc. And everyone knows that. So if it is the case that nobody believes that they are actually compensating their sins, that suggests that people are mostly using this as a convenient excuse and not actually believing that they aren't doing bad things. So I think government is a bind, because either this compensates the harm that is done, or it so transparently doesn't that it's not clear in the alternative there would be substantial pressure to change this kind of stuff under their side of the house. But secondly, what happens in the alternative alternative is probably just strictly worse. They will continue to just like do internal diversity and claim that even if they don't care about the environment, that they are at least helping underprivileged women get better jobs in the area. That just means that you, as a person that cares specifically about your cause, do substantially worse and you're less able to get change under their side of the house. Or you give to charities that don't buy into ESG, that don't care about this, and are able to take immoral actors. But these are the most likely to be susceptible to the kind of political control we talked about. Proud to oppose. Everyone good? Okay, let's start time. Yeah. So, I think the first problem with opening opposition's case is that they assume the least charitable interpretation of the way the government is likely to do this. Firstly, both sides are discussing the same charity. So the charity that is willing to pursue the pragmatic, game-theoretically optimal strategy of getting as much money as possible on their side and redirecting it for good purposes is probably a charity that we can reasonably interpret will not define immorality to mean participates in the wage system of capitalism, i.e. everybody in our organization is so woke that they will not accept a single dollar from any financial or technological corporation. Because if that were the standard, then on their side, every single person leaves this charity and exits because of the high-profile instances of any corporate actor giving them money. But that's not true, right? We know this charity is able to sustain a base despite getting some amount of money from big donors, so we think that we can have a more realistic standard. What we set up is as follows. It's two things. Firstly, we think that individual charities will have discretion over what morality means, and that discretion is likely to be circumstantial based on the activities of that specific charity. So if your charity is participating in green activism or things that are kind of tangentially related to green activism, you probably don't want to be taking money from fossil fuel companies. If your charity is focused on human rights, then it's probably important for you to take an active and public stance against corporations that participate in human rights abuses abroad, like the Nestle Corporation. So please afford government the advantage of being able to say, we'll do this in a not completely idiotic way. Then, they say the argument that, oh, everybody is going to redefine every single thing as being immoral. I think that this argument is not comparative for the following reason. I'll take you in a second. Two reasons. One, we know that these people are aid workers and are working in a field in which there is some degree of pragmatism, right? There is some degree of having to balance the interest of getting money with the interest of making a positive change in the world. So we think that most people will be willing to stay in these organizations and accept some donations that might be neutral, but we do think that there is a tipping point for many of these people. Secondly, though, the key point I want to make here, and this actually is what flips most of their case, is that to the extent that most of the people in these charities do care about the ethics of where their donations come from, they do take on an expansive definition of morality. It is a very, very good strategy for you to differentiate yourself from all of the other major charities that are just taking 100% of this immoral money, right? Brian told you that many large organizations right now are in fact taking money from immoral sources, and so these individual workers have a choice, and if your charity is unique in that it is willing to take less of this money, then it creates a huge drain away from other charities and towards yours, which probably gives you a relative advantage, and we know for certain that your charity is doing good in the world, whereas we can doubt that many other large charities are, per the info slide, which means given the choice, you would prefer that more of these workers pick your charities over other alternatives. Closing.
Can you explain to me how your immoral acts of whitewashing stuff works, given that you believe that this is going to be cynically perceived and that the public isn't going to like these donations occurring in the first place?
So the public isn't going to like these donations occurring, we agree, but there also is some PR advantage that comes from a donation, right? There's like a balance of these two things, and you're pushing the balance in a favorable direction when your charity is actively identifying bad donors and returning money to them, and giving a clear reason for that, i.e. we won't take your money because you're invested in dirty fossil fuel projects abroad that you wouldn't like people to know about. But what I'm going to do for the rest of this speech then is focus on this as a political strategy. Let's accept that money is the end-all be-all and the only thing that we care about. Let's accept even that there wouldn't be pernicious corporate influence. All we're going to prove to you is that on our side, your charity gets more funding on balance and has more people to use that funding to create some kind of positive change. Let's do this in a couple of ways. First, let's distinguish the two types of donors we're talking about. On their side, they're talking about primarily big donors. We know a couple of things about these donors. The first thing we know is that these donors are primarily donating for getting PR advantages and things like tax benefits, and to the extent that those incentives are entrenched, they have some incentive to donate on either side of the house.
What we also told you, however, is that these people have information. They have analysts who are studying what kind of charities they're giving money to. They're studying the impact factor of the money that they're donating. They have things like ESG funds, for example, that are invested in lots of different organizations. And so the worst possible outcome here is that those bad actors redistribute some money away from your charity to another somewhat efficient charity that has well-established standards that they can find out through those teams of analysts. The total amount of good in the world doesn't meaningfully change from these big donors that they redistribute and you carve out a niche. But what we want to talk about are small and individual donors where we think the margin of change in terms of how much they're willing to donate and the impact of that donation is much, much larger. Firstly, let's establish that these are in fact the vast majority of charitable contributions. It is a fact that the vast majority of charitable contribution comes from small individuals, that small donors donate a higher portion of their income per capita than rich individuals do to charity, and that even though rich individuals are the top 1% of income earners, the bottom 99% still has more money. And so the consequence of this means is that there's a probably larger share of money that can be impacted from small and individual donors. Opening.
Our characterization is that they give into a charity, and it's sort of a coincidence that it's doing good, because the average window dressing they would do would actually not be good for the world. So it's not clear if they do leave your charity, why they're giving to an equivalently good thing under your side.
So this is exactly the point I want to make. Large donors have teams of analysts that are figuring out what charities to give to. Small donors often lack good information and are going off of, like you said, the ad in the subway, and we know that many large charities are not actually good, or at least are not putting that money to an effective use. So you would prefer that these small donors who A, represent a larger pool of money, and B, have a larger marginal propensity to donate an additional dollar, should redistribute their money from other organizations to yours. The way you do this is by staking out a clear lane vis-a-vis other charitable organizations. When you distinguish yourself as being of a higher moral standard or a higher moral caliber than other organizations, just on a relative basis, not on an absolute basis, it then means that many of these small donors become aware of the fact that you're turning away money from dirty fossil fuel companies like ExxonMobil, and those people become more willing to contribute to your organization. This is also the reason why more people become willing to join your organization, volunteer for your organization, and participate, given that they think that the prospectus for making some kind of change in your organization is higher, and they don't have some kind of alternative metric. They'll judge you based off of who you're accountable to, who gives you the money. Why are these two groups then ultimately more important and win the debate in terms of efficacy alone, irrespective of whether or not there is some kind of pernicious influence from closing? Firstly, in terms of workers, why are we better off? We explained to you two things. A is that it is harder to get a worker than it is to get a dollar because there are some entrenched incentives for people to donate, right? Things like altruism that you can act on in a fairly easy way, tax benefits, public relations, even social cohesion with people around you, but it's very, very hard to get someone to give up all of the trade-offs, to turn down things like consulting and participate in your organization abroad, and so you always face this kind of shortfall. Getting more of these people from other organizations is good for you. And B, this is a constraint on the effectiveness of your money, because even if you have loads of money, if you don't have people on the ground, then you can't actually deploy that money logistically on the ground. You have to use it for other sources that end up being less effective, more marketing and less of actual administration of goods on the ground, because you don't have the manpower or the person power to accomplish this. Secondly, why are the small donors better? Well, we've already explained this point. The marginal propensity to move from a bad donation to a good donation is higher, and the marginal propensity to donate is higher, and we think that's just a more reliable base of contributions. Like, if you are accountable on their side to people donating for pernicious self-interest, what gives them the most PR advantage, then their money moves around from time to time, and they ultimately aren't going to be a loyal contributor, but someone who's a small donor who cares about your cause is a repeat donor. They will give you maybe $10 a month every single month of their life, but over time, when you have millions and millions of these people, it probably means that you can do much more with much more money. We're very proud to propose.
Sorry about that. The reason why big donors donate is because they want something in return, because they want the tax benefits or because they want PR benefits. The reason this is true is companies are not altruistic. When they compute and analyze using their teams, they aren't figuring out the maximum amount of good they can create in the world. The reason this is true is just because it's impossible for them to do so, i.e., they live in a competitive marketplace in which every dollar that they lose and use for pointless reasons is money that is lost and goes to competitors, for instance. So why then do they donate? They donate because the tax benefits means that they actually have to give a smaller amount in terms of taxes than they would by donating. They do the PR benefits because they calculate that the benefits that they can do by being allowed to continuously abuse their workers and extract money is less than the amount that they're donating to this particular charity. So for these reasons, what I'm trying to say is that the companies and the actors who are giving money on their side are doing so for immoral reasons in order to benefit themselves and increasing the net amount of harm in the world. The counter assertion we get from OG is that, well, we just won't be idiots. We won't do this in a stupid way, and we only take money from the worst actors. So the strategy that they're doing here is the lazy thing of racing towards the middle, when they're saying, well, companies are smart, they won't take money when it's too immoral, and that outweighs the good, but we will take the money. Do you understand what I'm trying to say? So I think that the debate only functions on extremes, when both teams presuppose that we are going to make some trade-off, and to explain why our harm is more or less important than theirs. So, given all of that setup, the first thing I'm going to do then is explain why their primary harm, a backlash, is unimportant. So, I think Devesh is correct when he says, well, people already know about these donations happening, but they don't flood away from the charity. The reason that this happens, though, isn't because they know that the charity is not immoral, but rather because they don't care. The reason for this is just because accepting donations from an immoral actor is not an immoral act. The moral yardstick the vast majority of human beings use is moral utilitarianism. When they say, well, as long as we're doing good, that this creates benefit and that this is justified. The reason this is true is because we all make these trade-offs every single day. We work for companies that we know do bad things because we have no other choice. Being able to choose to not buy the cheap meats that come from factory farmed animals that bring harm is a privilege that is only afforded to rich people. So the vast majority of donors, volunteers, all of that, understand that what we're doing here is a really important thing. It's an active moral evil to reject money when you know it directly scales to benefits for someone else. And I think that for those reasons, you really, really ought to accept the money. I'll take closing.
If I steal Ahmed's car and give it to you, am I still complicit in a moral wrong, even if Ahmed gets to go to places faster?
What? No, this is completely different because I'm on a charity who's going to use that car to do 1,000 different things. Like, if Ahmed were just using the car to, go on joyrides, and I were using it to deliver vaccines from one thing to another, then maybe, yeah, we think that that's justified. Okay, opening?
So it can simultaneously be true that people are practical and that when presented with one choice that is affirmatively preferable in terms of morality, they will pick that choice.
Yeah, what I'm saying is it's very, very clearly not. Most people don't care. Greg also gave you a ton of analysis to why charities have a high degree of control over the public image. Okay, why then is this money incredibly valuable? Greg tells you it scales up, it means that we aren't at risk of going under, all of these important things. The claim we get from opposition is, well, these charities are already well established, therefore they don't really need the money. The first response is, they're well established in the status quo, but as their own claim that you need to distinguish yourself from other big charities by actively rejecting this money, they concede that in the status quo, the majority of big charities are accepting money from these actors who we deem immoral. Therefore, in our world, the risk that they go under substantially increases. So, the other thing to note is that the fact that they're okay right now doesn't mean that they're okay in perpetuity, because small donors are responsive to different things happening. Their claim is, no, you're just constant, like you donate $10 a month without giving any reason why. The reason why is because people have trade-offs. We have limited budgets, and we often dedicate a set amount of our money to charity. And the way we do this is we acknowledge that there's therefore a trade-off, a zero-sum game in the money we're giving to one charity vis-a-vis another. And the reason this is important is because then you give money this month to Ukraine, for example. The next month, when you forget about this, you might donate it to another refugee crisis or to a climate organization. It's highly inconsistent, which means that your charity is extremely transient in nature.
The reason this matters is twofold. The first is long-term impacts are insignificant. You know that you can only count on this money for a small amount of time, and therefore to maximize the things you do right now, which is why the short-term direct impact of these things is the most important impact on the ground. But the second important thing, and the reason this matters, is also because when you care about, this is a this house as debate, they say, well, if they are donating to you, you donate to someone else. Yeah, but you, or as a charity, don't just exist to increase the good in the world. You care about, for example, malaria, or you care about climate, or you care most of all about yourself continuing to exist into the future, which is why it's very, very important that you take this money, even if the counterfactual, it might go to someone else. The second thing I want to say then is that it's also just the case that the money directly causes benefits, because you can, even if you're already doing a decent amount of good, you can always do more good. And this is directly correlated with the money that you're getting in your donations, because there are variable costs to doing good in addition to the fixed costs we talked about earlier. So, for example, this means that you can do things like buy a proportionally larger quantity of vaccines, or do things such as put money into sustaining and upkeeping a certain piece of infrastructure that requires constant input. And the reason this matters is because when the need to scale up is oftentimes what allows you to create the most amount of good, because the areas that are currently not being helped are areas that aren't being helped because there are high barriers to this. In terms of finance, for example, or because they're hard to reach. So when we get a substantially greater amount of money, we're uniquely able to expand this and give people in far-flung villages cataracts treatment and surgery, where otherwise they would never have been able to achieve this. For those reasons, immediate, direct, vast sum of money is what creates the vastest amount of moral good. So I just want to quickly just kill the image thing and the harms that might come with PR companies, with like allowing companies to like rehabilitate their image. The first thing is like it doesn't work. Like Jeff Bezos gave so much money, we don't care, we know he does bad shit, and we understand that he's only doing this because of his own self-interest. The second thing is this is really non-unique, right? Because you end up giving this money to other charities anyway, so it's unclear why your rejection creates any net good in the world. But the third thing is like your image is not correlated with your ability to escape legislation, and companies continue doing bad things either side of the house.
Panel ready? 3 extensions from closing government. Firstly, why even if the immoral donations lead to positive outcomes, you still ought principally reject those donations. Secondly, the harm that donations does to your ability to affect social change. And thirdly, the massive benefits you accrue by reaping those donations. Let me frame opening opposition out of the debate and their money clash first. You as a charity, note, have already been successful and are currently in the process of achieving success. Trivially, what this means is you are likely to get a significant amount on either side of the house in the absence of immoral actors. There are 3 structural reasons for this. Firstly, you likely are an effective altruism charity, insofar you've already attained a degree of success to begin with, and often the charities that are the most effective are those charities that adhere to effective altruism standards. Not only is there a significant community of EA donors in the tech community, there are significant amounts of NGOs who are committed to causes like effective altruism in the status quo. You can tap into NGO budgets on either side of the house and accrue a good degree of money, even if you get marginally more. Secondly, wealth accumulation isn't inherently immoral. Lots of millionaires make money off things like selling books. I think that's when Bernie Sanders became a millionaire. But more importantly, you get green tech startups that are invested in solving climate change, and a variety of corporations committed to CSR requirements. Insofar as they make this money off of moral actions, I have no idea why there are necessarily more actors who are immoral. Thirdly, you are already able to attain a degree of change without accepting immoral donations in the past. This implies that, firstly, your base of donors probably cares about the fact to reject immoral donations in status quo, because they donate to you instead of charities that take immoral donations. But secondly, you probably don't need this flow of wealth, insofar as the motion says you are successfully in the process of accruing positive change. But secondly, so this means on either side, you probably have at least some degree of funds to continue making the successful change you want to. Secondly, they say that corporations have incentives to PR virtue signal in more harmful ways at the point at which they can no longer donate to this one accepted charity. I doubt this is a tipping point, but note that corporations' metric incentives virtue signal on either side of the house. This is unlikely to be a tipping point in terms of them capitalizing on whitewashing. First extension. Why is it principally wrong to accept donations from immoral actors, even if it were the case that opening opposition is entirely correct and they achieve more some kind of societal benefit? Note that opening government and opening opposition get into a back and forth of whether or not this makes the charity more effective. I've already explained and broken this deadlock by explaining you necessarily get more funds, but even if it is the case opening opposition right will take the highest burden in this debate now. Note that when the charity accepts donations from actors it considers immoral, it accepts money that was accrued as the result of a moral wrong. This is for 3 reasons. Firstly, the company in question accrued its capital off the backs of oppression. That is to say, say, if it was a consulting company that went into a developing nation and advised an autocratic ruler on how to better restrict the agency of its populace, it accrued that wealth on the basis of restricting the aggregate amount of benefit that the individuals wanted to achieve. Secondly, the acceptance of the donation not only allows the company to evade scrutiny, even to a limited extent, its ability to accept those donations and its tacit endorsement from a charity allows it to continue to perpetuate that oppression and harm into the future, even to a limited extent. Thirdly, even if the action is not objectively immoral, you as the charity believe it is. That is, your charity on aggregate represents the interests of the individuals that donated to you. Insofar as we consider money to be an extension of the self and one's will, and people donate to your charity as the absence of others because they believe in your mission and likely dislike large harmful donors, it's probably the case that they truly firmly believe this action is immoral. But secondly, people that donate to you have a revealed preference for likely considering those specific actors to be immoral, insofar as they choose to donate to a charity that attains success in the absence of embracing it. This means that at the point at which you accept that wealth, you are tacitly endorsing a moral wrong. This is pernicious at the non-consequentialist level because it is always wrong to instrumentalize someone immorally, even for moral ends. I have 4 intuition pumps for why this is true. Firstly, if I steal Ahmed's car and give it to XK, XK is still complicit in the moral wrong, even if they use it to drive around and distribute vaccines to people, insofar as that benefit was accrued unjustly off the oppression of another. In the same manner, donating malaria nets to save individuals in the developing world that was accrued because you accepted a massive donation from McKinsey tacitly endorses the restriction of agency that was imposed upon those individuals at the point at which McKinsey advised the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. Note that knowledge is the delineation between those harms. At the point at which you are fully aware of the immorality of that action, believe it is immoral, you are perpetuating that immoral harm and you continue to do so. The second reason why it is wrong to accept these actions is because the state does not currently jail people randomly in order to deter crime, even if it gained a degree of social benefit. The reason why this is true is we consider the harm to agency that is imposed greater than the benefit that can be accrued insofar as individuals have a moral right to that form of autonomy. Thirdly, we still punish people who would steal from a supermarket even if they were impoverished and even if they had other delineating manners in order in which to achieve them. And fourthly, the state would not allow a hospital to take out random organs that belong to you in order to save the lives of 5 other people. Insofar as these individual actors strip the rights of the individuals under oppression and you participated in accepting that moral wrong and tacitly endorse that individual, you are culpable for that harm and the utilization of that money. This is important because insofar as everyone has equal rights and different preferences, we think that charity has a higher moral obligation to avoid doing wrong. Why? Because we recognize that utilitarian benefits are secondary in terms of the tacit violation of someone's autonomy. When that charity accepts the money, it's instrumentalizing the harm done for pro-social means. That is bad. Oh.
This argument makes no sense if, as you claim, you are an effective altruist because you don't care about the other things that precede utilitarianism.
No. Pay attention to the framing that I gave at the start. Insofar as you attained this success in the absence of accepting immoral donations, this means that A, you don't need those donations, but B, your base likely has a revealed preference for donating to you on that basis of you not accepting those immoral donations. Why does accepting the donation hurt your ability to accrue positive change? Opening government goes here to some extent, but they don't give you the reason why the charity cares. That is to say, they don't explain why, even if it is the case that you, like a charity might care about getting more money, why is the case they care most about that? Twofold reasons why that's true. Firstly, as a charity, in successfully improving the world, you likely do care about making positive change, but in so if you use other incentives like reputational benefits, your PR and so on is linked to your ability to create positive change because you accrue reputational benefits as a result. There are 3 reasons this is true. Firstly, often large corporations offer donations conditional on you not criticizing them. This looks like Bain Capital making large donations to EA charities conditional on them not critiquing consulting practices overseas. The specific conditions of acceptance make it harder not only for you to speak out about them, but speak about those issues in general, since you can't critique other corporations that do similar practices outside that sphere. This broadly limits your ability to offer those critiques in the public sphere, insofar as you're a large charity that have a degree of social capital. We think that's bad. Secondly, accepting those donations makes it harder for accrue trust in communities when you donate and make change. If you're a charity that's building wells in Nigeria, but you accept donations from immoral actors that were complicit in perpetuating oppression in countries that border Nigeria or adjacent, it's likely to distrust you to a vast extent. This makes it harder for you to accrue your mission to a significant degree. Closing. Opening.
How would these people know the source of your donations, and why would they care more than they want clean drinking water?
You Google opensecrets.org, and then you go take it from a different charity instead. Moving on. This limits the flexibility of the charity as well, because insofar as your speech is limited and the avenues to which you donate are likely more limited, you have less capacity to generate that kind of positive change in the first place, insofar as you're no longer able to donate to specific actors. But fifthly, successful charities tend to be backed by a wide array of altruistic individuals and activists. It's not only the case, as OG says, that they move away as small donors, but you as a charity care about those small donors, because those were the people who stuck with you before you were successful, who were donating to you in the absence of those large corporations, before McKinsey or Bain Capital came to donate to you in the first place. The reason why you care about those actors, and the reason why you care about making them successful, is because they make up your base. These are the interactions that you have with them day to day, and these are the people you have the long-term established relationships with. So even if you make your charity more successful on their side of the house, you lose out on the people who have been with you the longest and the people who have supported you the most. What happens when you reject those donations? Firstly, you likely get more internal cohesion within the charity because you don't get divisions between these people and others. But secondly, you signal to other charities with the capacity to attain success in the absence of of a massive amount of capital, prompting further action. Thirdly, you create competition between other donors to align your image in order to get donations. Insofar as your endorsement conveys a tacit acceptance of good CSR and things like this, you create a preemptive incentive for more companies to moderate their behavior in a positive manner. For all of those reasons, incredibly proud to win from CG.
Yeah. I'll just take it. I'll just take it. Fine.
I'm going to start the speech in 3, 2, 1. We have two simple arguments from closing opposition. The first is on why the strategy of taking immoral donations makes your charity more successful, independent of the top half unresolved clash of whether grassroots or 1% donations are going to increase your revenue. And secondly, why rival charity donations make things worse. I want to note before I start that on the second one, opening opposition, in fairness, did say that a rival charity may get the money, they may be worse, they may do alternative things for you. I'm going to go far deeper in explaining why it doesn't just harm you, it harms your ability to get public donations, it harms the space of charities, and therefore we're going to take it over them due to the extent of harm. Before I do that, I want to do two things. Firstly, I want to make 3 observations about this debate, but before that, I want to respond to CG very quickly. One, on the principle. Nobody has been able to prove that independent of this round happening and you taking or accepting the donation, that these people still wouldn't be making money in immoral ways, which means that this money is already made. This means two things. Firstly, if we're going to do like weird principle stuff, then you can actually adapt to the world in which you exist to create your moral compass. So the fact that the money has been made already means that your moral compass is not that the money and accruing of that money is bad, it is rather that we can do good things with it, and that is the moral consideration which you have. The other way to look at it is, if I was dying and in the US you have no healthcare, and somebody was rich and they were willing to give me money, I wouldn't say, oh my gosh, I'm going to die because that individual made that money immorally. They have to sort that out or they're losing this debate bad. Two, in terms of the matching of actions, it's very unclear why the donors who are giving money to my charity and my endeavours have actively harmed the people and the beneficiaries I have. Given that they're likely to give to various and different causes, they need to prove the extent of that matching in order for their harm to be important. Thirdly, open secrets. I mean, they literally said that the reason that they are going to be able to get less goodwill is open secrets. Have you ever been on it? I have. Okay, moving on to observations. The first thing I would say is just like on a weighing, I don't think that whitewashing has been proved. And we did ask a POI to explain, like, why is it that whitewashing is going to occur? We hear the reason for, and given that like people are going to see this cynically in the first place, why can whitewashing of these immoral acts occur? We got no sufficient response. Which means that at best what you are able to do on their side of the house is potentially call out a bad actor who operates in a space different to your own charity. I would note that this is the most important way in the debate, because the best impact that they have is saying that this person who does bad things, like Jeff Bezos does bad things, and then we're able to call out the oppression of those workers. But you're a water company, and your main consideration is that, and so the harm is always going to be negative because you care about your own cause more. Second point of observation is on workers. We reject the binary that people are either moral and they reject private enterprise, or they're not. We note there's often a revolving door between people who go into private enterprise and then add value to charities. So if you care about workers, then you probably shouldn't like actively alienate corporate interests. But secondly, I would note that most people are pragmatic, and as the DLO says, it is actually a privilege to be able to take that binary stance. And what I mean by this is, for example, if on our side we get more incomes and more people are able to work for these corporations, I think there are altruistic people who for like $30,000 would work for them, but on $20,000 they simply could not. We get more workers and we're able to resolve the clash that way. Finally, I would note that there is a huge amount of regulation that companies are facing. Opening opposition says that companies want to be ESG compliant. I point out that companies are literally losing money right now because they're not. There is taxonomy and regulation. We had the climate conference. What this means is that you're not going to moderate the causes of the charities that you give money to, because you're not doing this to gain influence. You're doing it to mitigate the harms of negative public pressure, which absolve the idea that they're going to moderate these companies' operations. Before I explain our points opening up,
So organizations that say we won't take money from Russian oligarchs may not stop Russian oligarchs from doing bad things, but they still get access to millions and millions of dollars of donations from people who are sympathetic
No,
to
they
the cause.
don't, because you need to explain why whitewashing was perceived by the public negatively and that reduces donations. First argument then. OG and OO go back and forth on this unresolved clash. Independent of this, here's why the strategy of large immoral donors is good versus the grassroots. Taking OG at their best and assuming that there is a PR harm to the charity. Number one, because of cyclicality. Public donations are cyclical because of the fact that when people have less donations, people give less during a recession and therefore they are less able to fund the charity. This makes your operations really unstable, and more importantly, people become very, very clannish when they're poor. They start to give less money to refugees, they give more money to things at home. So for the large amount of causes which aren't directly related to people, they are all screwed on their side. Donors come directly to you, and I note that immoral donors are the most likely to be counter-cyclical because they do things like short during recessions, they benefit from more unemployment and lower wages. So that secures your operations. Two, you get more scrutiny specifically for these donations. This is an OG flip, right? Because the donor wants to prove they did good, so they scrutinize you more for specifically these operations. But secondly, the charity PR response will be to demonstrate how much they've used the money for good to mitigate the fact that they're taking the money from the immoral actor in the first place. The weighing here is simple. Better does not mean best. You can do better, you can be more efficient, you can be more accountable. That allows your money to go further. Thirdly, public donations increase inefficiency. Public donation pandering increases inefficiency. So what I mean by this is people don't respond to effectiveness. They respond to PR adverts. They respond to bleeding stories about trying children. So when you shift your model away from taking private donations and hyper-focus on public donations, it just becomes an inefficiency because you spend more money on these adverts and there's a race to the bottom to spend money on those adverts. And therefore, even if they prove that you get more money, we prove that you use it less inefficiently on their side of the house. We take that.
Our case was in no way contingent on the immoral actors causing the same harm to your constituents. The fact that the harm is perceived as immoral by the charity creates the complicity.
Sure, I don't buy your principle. I've already explained why. Save it and wait. Okay, number two. Why is it that rival charity donations are worse? I would note here that one really important observation, which is that these rival charities are likely to be less successful than your own charity. And I would note this is the reason why. Charities know more about each other and their own space than the general public. So charities have the knowledge of when an operation is inefficiency. Charities are different people go in the revolving door. You'll hear about how this company is inefficient. Scandals will be known within the charity sphere, a decade before they break, and therefore you're likely to have better knowledge of who is good and who is bad and who is inefficient, even on metrics that the wider public don't care about, like inefficiency. I think seeing that money go to alternative sources is bad for you, not just because of divergent interests, but because these people are able to do less good projects than you, and therefore, if the feedback loop of doing well means that the public is going to donate to you more, is true, that means the charity space in general is doing less good things because the money is being diverted to less good interests. What this means is less public donations by OG's own metric come towards you as a charity because of, in the space in general, and also because these charities are less accountable than yours, they are more likely to have scandals, which tarnishes the reputation of all charities because people feel like charities are the same and they don't go on open secrets, so they give less money to charities in general, which means regardless of whether you believe the 1% or the grassroots, it all gets worse. I think we've basically resolved every clutch of this debate. See you in a minute.
Okay.
Great. For POIs, I'll just call out when I'm ready to take one. I'll take one at 1 and 5:30. Please have them ready, because I don't want my speech to be interrupted. Great. 3, 2, 1. means can never be disconnected from the ends because means are ends creating. The means are like a seed and the end is like the tree. There's the same inviolable connection between them that makes the quality of that tree contingent on the seeds used. That is to say, what math extension tells you is you reap exactly what you sow and you cannot pretend that does not happen. One piece of framing before getting into weighing and team by team comparison. This is an actor motion. That is to say, what is immoral is what we as the charity believe to be immoral. And it doesn't matter if in fact it is subjective, maybe some rich people are good or bad. We've already come to that conclusion that they are bad within our own frame of mind and our own frame of preferences. So any sort of kind of rebuttal to that, please ignore it. Weighing on the principle, while what Matt told you is particularly going to outweigh every other team you're on. Firstly, uncertainty. That is to say, it is a certain guarantee that you will be doing something you at least partially believe is immoral, right? Versus uncertainty as to whether or not that money is going to effectively be used. Now, what do I mean by this? Firstly, the money you might think might be optimally redistributed, but it might, in a sec, but it might not be optimally redistributed because of external conditions. For example, you might accept the money and there's a war and a conflict and you all have to flee. I don't know if that money is going to be redistributed or not, but I know for a fact that I did something bad. So uncertainty, you wait for that. And secondarily, I don't know how the world will respond to necessarily our actions. That is to say, maybe we get more because other shitty people give us money. Maybe we get less because people are pissed off from that. I don't know how the world will react, but there's a certain guarantee that I as a charity believe I did something wrong to begin with. So uncertainty, you wait for that. Quickly, quick.
You claim we don't need immoral funds because the EA community will donate. The problem is that effective altruists want to do the most good, so they give to the charities in the top 5 of Gidwell's recommended list. The average charity, even if it's effective, is not the Malaria Consortium.
I don't know why every single charity that or individual that we have to get from is immoral, but what Matt tells you is that the people that we are largely getting these immoral actions from, we believe them to be immoral because they've done actions we already believe to be harmful. That is to say, there is a guarantee that we know they've done something bad to begin with. We don't have to speculate as to whether or not they did some sort of like human rights abuses or worker abuses. We already know that because the motion tells us that we know that. Secondly, on reversibility. Once we accept it, it is hard to control the outcome after. That is to say, the actions of the actor cannot be controlled indefinitely. That is to say, maybe we change their behavior or maybe we get some more money afterwards. I don't know whether or not that's the case, but the irreversibility that we've done something bad that we cannot otherwise take away, and we've established our reputation as someone that takes money from things we otherwise believe to be moral. And thirdly, on preference matching. That is to say, it's uncertain as to whether or not every one of our constituents will get the dollar equally, or that the money will be used in the way, or they enjoy the way the money is used. What do I mean by this? Maybe some of the people want a well, maybe a school, maybe like a hospital. We can't assess all of those preferences. What we do know is that they believe in the values of that charity and they believe what we believe to be immoral. So given we don't know the preferences of all the people we are trying to represent as the charity, it is in our interest to be as maximally aggregative of all of their preferences. Insofar as they believe in our values and believe this thing would otherwise be immoral, you weigh on that insofar as the motion is based on the interest of that actor. Getting into CEOs and other teams, no. Firstly, they say it's immoral money is already made, so you should otherwise take it to do good things. One, if the opposite is true, I don't know why they don't just donate to a different charity that would also otherwise do good, so there's no delta there. Secondarily, what Matt's case is about is the complicity of doing it. We are doing a wrong, and that's all that matters. What happens afterwards doesn't fucking matter, but the one choice you made at that moment is all that you should otherwise consider. We are responsible for our own actions, not the actions of other people. Secondarily, they say it's unlikely that has affected our constituents, so who gives a shit? That doesn't matter because as a charity, we care about making the world a better place, not necessarily just our own constituency. And thirdly, they say open secrets is a secret. Like, okay, Google, like you can use Google and the news, but then they say you could otherwise see the money going elsewhere, and that's a bad thing. But if you can't use or you don't know about open secrets and the money going elsewhere, I don't know why your constituents could also see that money otherwise going elsewhere and then not otherwise buy into you. Then let's get into O, but before that I'll give them another POI, so I have 2 POIs, right?
Even within the tech space, startups and VCs are dwarfed by Meta and Alphabet and large corporations. Nobody has beaten the claim that companies with the most incentive and capacity to invest are the largest corporations and the ones that specifically fuck the world over in the way that you're trying to help it.
Great. This is perfect because it gets me right into their case. Their case is that you get substantial amount of donation because of these big firms, right? A few assumptions that I'm going to take out now. One, they say that vast amounts of rich people are just inherently immoral, and it's a large amount of our funding. Keep in mind Matt's rebuttal to this, but secondarily, I don't know why you believe the other ones who have already donated to you are necessarily immoral, but even if you don't buy that, we have a sufficient amount of moral people already because we've used them to get to the point where we're now successful. That is to say, they never say why we need the Jeff Bezos or we need the Apples or the Metas and not the people that have already donated to us, that have allowed us to get to that system that we already have. That is to say, we have enough people we believe are moral to maintain the fixed cost that we don't really care about any additional immoral people. Secondarily, to say that our impact or like our capacity of alternative of like small scale donations like aren't going to be enough because it's small, it's very fickle, and it's inconsistent. Here's why this rebuttal is better than what OG gives. One, direct religious and communal affiliation that makes it more than one-off donation that affects your ability to access the afterlife. Most people in the world who donate are religious, they want to go to heaven, that is a consistent cash flow basis. And secondarily, social media makes it very easy to recruit people's emotions. So even if those emotions are very fickle, we can target those fickle emotions whenever we want and send the ads that reignite that emotion, that fickle emotion to make it not fickle. But thirdly, and this is critical, you don't depend on them given you've already reached a critical mass. And this is the upshot. The practical and principal case of all of the bets relies on that funding having a meaningful tipping point. If it doesn't, we win. Why doesn't it have a meaningful tipping point? Because of the standard that we've already reached. One, an endowment that we have that perpetuate long-term interest funding means we always get continuous funding over time and can stay afloat and save lives. Secondarily, we have deals with various governments to operate in areas that gives us licenses for long-term planning and operations. Thirdly, it's likely that we are incorporated into our state's foreign policy and international organizations because we are largely successful, so we have a lock-in mechanism to always be effective in the world. And fifthly, we have like diverse funding pools. Let's say there is a tipping point in money, which is why you prefer money from other sources versus the rich. One, you ought to have a consistent and wait for a consistent and certain cash flow. OG says you prefer consistent cash flow, but not why the alternative also cannot be consistent. The reason why it can't is because one, rich people might have the money that could otherwise be frozen and cannot use, which means even if they have a bigger pool or bucket, that bucket could be toxic and affect the entire bucket of pool of funding that we already have. Why do we beat it on OG? Matt already gave you the win, but let me reiterate and make it incredibly clear. Our case applies even if we get less money comparatively. That is to say, I do not know why as a charity care about having the most amount of money as opposed to doing what I believe is right and what my people believe is otherwise right. It matters because I don't know why other side gets a tipping point, but I do care about justifying the means for the ends. As a charity, Matt proved to you why you probably shouldn't fucking do this. Pose.
Thank you.
I have too many sheets of paper. Starting off with 3, 2, 1. Opening opposition may have proven more money, but that money is useless if these immoral actors moderate your operations, push out your workers, screw over your industry due to inefficient donations, and destabilize your other funding sources. The thing is that Zarina proves that all of those things don't happen on our side of the house, and that's why we're winning this debate. I'm going to go through this team by team. I'm going to start by weighing against opening opposition. The first thing we do is we sidestep this clash about whether or not you get more money, and say that regardless of that, the charity is significantly better, for two different reasons. Firstly, because of the certainty you have, because these donations are likely to be counter-cyclical and how that's a good thing. And secondly, about how you have less money, you need to spend less money on things like advertising, for example, because you only need to target specific billionaires. The closing government response is to say, aha, you're a big charity. There's literally no information in the info slide that would lead to this. You could very easily be a small charity that runs like one school, for example, that sells something that's doing good in the world, and it's genuinely unclear to me as to why they can just claim we're the largest effective altruism charity. That's probably statistically more unlikely out of all the charities that exist. I think that both of these things outweigh the scale benefit that we get from opening opposition for two different reasons. Firstly, we have one less point of failure. We don't rely on getting more money in the first place. We just need an equivalent amount of money for our benefits to come into play, so that's a good thing. But secondly, I think what we prove is that these charities continue to function in the first place, and that's more important than necessarily scaling up the benefits. Because on our side of the house, what they do is they provide
some initial units of like really good utility and do the most effective things at the start because they have more limited money, that's what they'll do. Whereas if they get more money overall, that might lead to less effective things over time. So insofar as we show that the core elements of this charity are preserved in the long run because of the certainty argument that Zarina gives, our claim is more important. The second thing Zarina talks about is this idea of alternatives and how that will lead to directly harming you as a charity. Because I think the incentive these people are probably either image-based or maybe they genuinely care about what the charity does and so want to donate to you. I think Zarina argues that if this happens, you now donate to worse alternatives overall. Closing government say, no, they'll just donate to other good charities, so this is fine. I would note that this contradicts opening government's own analysis. Because if opening government are correct, and what these people care about is image, then what that means is they'll engage in charities that will likely increase their image. That's why people like the Sacklers do things like donate to art galleries rather than, donate to actually effective charities in the first place. So what that means is actually the money is likely to go to bad places, and the analysis that CG give doesn't make sense considering opening government's analysis. Zarina then takes this idea of alternatives significantly further because she explains how this is likely to lead to a direct harm to your charity insofar as these billionaires now donate to other worse charities, and that tars the perception of the charity sector as a whole because people think these institutions are generally useless and aren't doing good things necessarily, which means it translates to the small donors that opening government want donating not actually being able to do so because they think the whole purpose of donating towards charities is kind of pointless because it's just used by these projects of whitewashing and so on. That's where the alternative thing comes into place, whereas at the very least on outside the house you can do things like negotiate with these billionaires to ensure that the money goes and is used in necessarily good ways. Let's look then at opening government. The first thing they say is that whitewashing needs to work as an individual is necessarily leaving you. I think that if everyone is aware of the fact that this money is coming from a really problematic place and that's likely to harm your charity, the charity itself is presumably aware of this and will probably try and do things like condition these donations or be very transparent about how it's working in a good way. So I think this backlash is probably likely to be somewhat limited. The second idea about workers leaving, again, I don't think this is necessarily going to happen. Firstly, for the reason that I think these workers are probably able to morally justify this themselves. I think even if we can't say that, or we might think it's immoral, it's very easy for them to say, this money is going to a utility good way, and this money otherwise would be used in the worst way. So they can actually justify continuing work to the charity quite easily. But also secondly, I'm not sure where they're going to move from. If opening government's analysis is true, and that these donations are systematic and exist in most charities, then where the hell these work is going to go? They can't go to any better or holier than thou kind of place. The second thing they say is that, PY.
So no speaker has contested that the constraint for charities is their ability to recruit people on the ground, not the marginal dollar. We bring in more of those people by directly and publicly differentiating from every other charity that won't take our moral stance.
I don't think that's necessarily true because these individuals probably have their own incentives about which charity they want to work for and so on. Then the next thing they say is that the money will otherwise go to good places because these people have effective altruism and lists. I think this is, again, incredibly unlikely for the reason that, again, these people primarily care about their image and so it's unclear why they donate to the most effective altruistic thing. The last thing they talk about is these small donors. I think this is an incredibly unlikely extension for a few different reasons. Firstly, the average person is not some weird niche effective altruist that's only in debating, right? Which means that these people probably aren't going to actually donate to the most effective thing, they'll just donate to the most emotive thing or what they necessarily care about, which means you need to engage in things like advertising and mass advertising to get people on their side. Secondly, the harms that Zarina gives to you about cyclicality and so on, meaning that these donations don't end up being consistent over time and so aren't as easy to rely upon. The problem is, even if some of these individuals are as opening government describes, that's not enough for them. Because you need the vast majority, or a large number of these small donors to come together and combine to account for the same amount of money as one rich donor would provide. So what that means is, as long as we show that a significant minority of people are like this, that's enough to mean that this argument about small donors doesn't stand. Before I talk about closing government, I'll take a POI from them.
If it's true that the Sacklers only care about PR, they're unlikely to donate to your charity on either side insofar as your charity is successfully making the world better and isn't a PR site.
Yeah, but the point is that insofar as these people have come to you and approached you for a donation, that's the point which this debate occurs and that's the point which you should take it. Alright, on closing government, this identical principle. The first thing is, I genuinely don't know why you as an actor would care about this principle in the first place. I think it's very, very easy for you to justify to yourself you're taking this money. I think people have a tendency to kind of show that their actions are moral in the first place, and it's very easy to say, this money would be worse otherwise, and so it's actually a good thing that I'm doing this. I don't think that necessarily works. But even if we suppose that actually you do suddenly massively care about this morality, the thing is, and this is what Zarina says, is that your morality and your options are bounded by the choices that you could possibly make and the circumstances in which you live. The point is that this money has already been made. The question now is how that money gets used, and I think that you should probably take an active role in using it and diverting it towards necessarily good causes, rather than a weird idea of complicity that we get from closing opposition. Because also doing nothing itself just means that that money will be used elsewhere, and so the harm still occurs in any case. Closing government can wash their hands of their sins while the world continues burning. We on closing opposition think that it's much better to try and make the world a better place in the first place, and do that in the best possible way. The second thing they talk about is signalling. I'm pretty sure this is somewhat derivative of their opening, but also beyond that, I just think that this is a massive burden to take on. What they need to show is that suddenly you differentiating yourself in this way will translate to every single small donor donating purely based on this rather than other things they may have about what issues that are close to them or emotiveness or whatever, and then that leading to other charities doing this, and then you have a massive first mover disadvantage here. Other people then get this money and can use it on advertising against you. For all these reasons, proud to oppose.